Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about a topic called completing the square, which is something that becomes more and more important as you get on to more advanced quadratics problems. And to introduce this topic, we're going to look at what happens when you take a parenthesis and you square it, as you see in these three examples up here. Now by this point, you guys should be pretty well trained that you know you can't just distribute the squared to both parts here. You actually have to write the parenthesis twice and then do FOIL, and you get each of the answers that I have written down here. I'm not going to go through all the steps, but that's something that you guys should feel comfortable with at this point. What I want to do is look at our answers from each of these problems and look for a connection between the B term and the C term over here. So there's actually a pattern that happens every time you square a parenthesis between those two terms. And in order to do that, we need to figure out some sort of pattern between how they got from the 10 to this 25 here, and how you got from this 18 to 81, negative 8 to 16. Now, this is something that maybe you see it after a little thinking, maybe you don't, but once it's kind of mentioned to you and once you've been shown it, you'll see where I'm going with things. If we take this first example here, look at this 10. If we took half of 10, we get 5. And if we square that 5, we get our 25 right here. So we took half of this number, we got 5. We squared it, that got us this number over here. On the second example, if we take half of this 18 right here, positive 18, we get a 9. And 9 squared is 81. And finally on our third problem here, half of negative 8 is negative 4. Negative 4 squared is a positive 16. So anytime you have a parenthesis squared, we have this nice pattern going on, this relationship between B and C, and that's worth writing down as a note. So to get something called a perfect square trinomial, you need to take half of B and then square it to get C. So to get a perfect square trinomial, take half of B and square it to get C. If we have a trinomial, a quadratic like one of these guys over here, where that happens, then we know it's going to factor nicely into a parenthesis squared. Just looking at the problems in reverse, you can see we had this guy with that fit that characteristic. It factors into x plus 5 times x plus 5. This one factors to x plus 9 times x plus 9, etc. Now notice on these problems here that I wrote down the half. When I took half of 10, I wrote down a 5 right here. This guy actually factors if you do it into x plus 5 times x plus 5. If you do magic numbers, that's what you'll get. Or in other words, you get x plus 5 squared. When I wrote down this 9 here, this factors into x plus 9 squared, and this guy factors into x minus 4 squared. It's kind of a factoring shortcut with our magic numbers. I'm not going to bother showing it for these, but if you write down the half, that's actually what goes in the parentheses with x there. So let's practice this on a couple problems, just to kind of give you guys an idea of how this whole perfect square trinomial thing plays out. So we're going to take these problems and figure out what number we have to have here for C for it to actually be a perfect square trinomial. Again, a perfect square trinomial is when you factor it, you get the same parenthesis twice. So on the first problem, we saw our rule was that you take half of B. Half of B gets me a 6. And I do 6 squared, this number has to be a 36 right here. And if you were to factor this guy, x squared plus 12x plus 36, it's going to factor into x plus 6 times x plus 6. Or in other words, x plus 6 squared. On my second example here, I take half of negative 14, I get negative 7, and negative 7 squared is a positive 49. So this is my perfect square trinomial, and if I factor it, I get x minus 7 squared. Third guy, I've got a 20x right here, half of that is 10, 10 squared is 100. This will factor into x plus 10 squared. And on my final example here, I take half of my negative 7. Half of negative 7 is negative 3.5. So this isn't going to be quite as nice of an answer like the other ones. But if you do negative 3.5 squared, you'll get 12.25, positive 12.25. So usually when we factor things, we don't deal with decimals. It's pretty much all integers. But if you were to do magic numbers on this, this factors into x minus 3.5 in parentheses squared. So this little trick is going to be very helpful as we go on with this section here.